So thanks everyone. My name is
Actually, two
Oh,
seconds. We
sure,
have
sure,
to move.
sure. This is to remember. Everyone has been muted so as not to distract the presenter and other participants while the webinar is taking place. We're also recording the webinar, so to make sure that we're moving forward, there will be a few pauses during the presentation where we will take written questions. If you think of a question, there should be a chat function on the bottom of your screen, so type in your question and share it with us. We hope to take questions from the chat throughout the presentation and again at the end. For those of you who don't know, the webinar is part of our LGBTQ Power speaker series that we're offering really to just engage community and partner organizations across the state. The goal of these webinars is for LGBTQ and allied communities to hear about relevant advocacy opportunities, really just to get a broader understanding of what it takes to mobilize and advance LGBTQ protection statewide. So we had one in May about the barriers to legislative success. Milo, who is a lawyer here in the city, also did one in October about unpacking gender and existing protections and what that means for the TGNC community. We also had one a few weeks ago with the Hispanic Federation on engaging Latinx communities in civic organizing. And today we'll go through best practices for centering and empowering community and advocacy work with Focal New York. So as the center's advocacy work continues to grow, we really want to make sure that we are staying connected and informed with community across the state. So if all of you listening could quickly just take out your cell phone and text RiseOut to 69866. Doing so, you'll get updates on ways that you can take action for LGBTQ rights in New York whenever there's an opportunity to do so. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our presenters, Jason Walker and Janae Sumter from Bureaucracy.
Hello, how is everyone doing today? So I am Janae, and right beside me is Jason Walker. We are going to go over today what it looks like from the title of Marginalized to Emerging, centering our community voices in decision making. There we go. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about basically our story. So from choreography story to Jason and I both individually, moving to objectives and goals, context setting, getting you all familiar with what is decision making in the first place. Moving toward challenges, best practices, examples of success that we've had, and some best practices that we've also encountered as well as some of our challenges. Moving onto those examples of success. And then our questions and answers. So yes. All right, so a few reflection questions just to have you all thinking about a few things as we move through this entire webinar. So I just say a few questions for you all. So one is what can you do besides this? How can you take this action from this webinar and move it within your spaces as providers? Another question would be is why is it important to even having community voices important within the decision-making process? How can this information be used for outreach or just in general decision-making? And then how can advocates use this toward those long day, toward supporting targeted communities? And then at the bottom, engagement and mobilization is really breaking out what that looks like. So engagement. Community members involved in surfacing concerns, helping them understand the extent of the problem or the issue, and preparing them for them to take action. Honestly, that's what that is. Engagement can be as simple as attending a community meeting, sharing those experiences, and or even learning how to lead direct actions with sitting with elected officials. Mobilization looks like bringing community members together to work toward achieving a goal. Mobilization includes anything from, like I said, direct actions, marches, rallies, public testimony, anything of that sort, press conferences, even writing letters and emails for campaigns. So just seeing how all of these different components come together, especially within the decision-making process and afterwards.
And just to add an additional element to that, the combination between engagement and getting folks directly involved through these different type of activities or actions is what we kind of like conceptualize as meaningful engagement of communities who have been systematically excluded from power or from decision making, right? So it's through the formula of engagement plus mobilization, or mobilizing folks, is where we get meaningful engagement in centering marginalized communities.
Okay, who are we? Jason, would you like to start?
Sure. So my name is Jason Walker. I'm the HIV/AIDS campaign coordinator for Vocal New York, where I've been in this working for the organization for 5 years. Come from an AIDS activist background. I'm a queer man, also living with the virus, and I do a lot of I help to lead our city and state work around helping to support the New York State's plan to end the AIDS epidemic by focusing on organizing, mobilizing, and creating leaders from directly impacted people. So homeless folks living with HIV is a community that I engage in our political campaign work.
Alrighty, thank you, Jason. I am Janae, she, they pronouns, the craxi organizer. So I've been with Vocal for about a year and a half now. Goodness, a year and a half. Started with doing canvassing work and moved toward organizing. I come from not too much of a similar background from Jason, but similar at the same time. I have experienced homelessness quite a few times, and I'm also within the LGBT community, identify as queer. The reason why I care about this so much and endearing as a part of me as a queer young person, I'm only 23 years old. So being affected by that and understanding, the importance of having young voices being heard within our new age and the generation with our voices as being young people, we are literally the future. So how can we start really coming together and realizing these issues, how they're impacting us, and how we can move forward to change the system, especially within a positive way. So through leadership development, through outreach, through decision making, that's how we come together within Craxi. That's how we move forward in general. So yes. All right, so our story, who are we? So Craxi is an youth and a young adult. I like to say young adult because not too many people like to identify as youth. But under 25 years old, we're an organizing project underneath Vocal New York. Cultivating leadership for queer young people, creating positive change in our community. And that looks like through direct action organizing, membership-led advocacy campaigns, educational trainings, and et cetera. We do that by challenging these existing structures that thrive on the mistreatment of, the treatment of poor young folks, especially those who are also high risk. So we're dedicated to ending these stigmas of discrimination, of criminalization that fuel its existence. So that's what Craxi is.
So we thought it would be important to show kind of like our system on how we try to save the world or to in a lot of these social issues that plague our society today. HIV/AIDS, Vocal New York stands for Voices of Community Activists and Leaders, and we believe in policies of justice and equity through politics of love and compassion is the ways in which we're going to be able to access that. And so we focus our work on 4 kind of like key areas. One is in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. 2, we want to end mass homelessness that we're seeing happening not only in New York City and across the state, but also across the country. 3, we want to ultimately end the war on drugs. We recognize that you can never have a war on drugs. What ultimately happens is that we see these policies impacting people, so we have a war on people. And we really want to restructure our drug policies to be more rooted in compassion and based off of a public health approach to drug policy rather than a criminal justice one. And then finally, we want to end mass incarceration. We dare to envision a world where we can operate without prisons, and we want to end the perpetual cycle of incarceration that happens within low-income communities across the state, but particularly communities of color. So that's kind of like our big grandiose visions and our missions as an organization. And the ways in which we access our ability to achieve that is that we created unions or kind of like a governing bodies of folks who are directly impacted by these 4 issues. And we call that sort of the mechanism in which we created for decision making to help inform how do we end the HIV/AIDS epidemic in low-income communities of color. We call that the Positive Leaders Union. As we try to tackle the homelessness crisis that's happening in New York City and New York State, we created a decision-making body and structure within our homelessness union. And then we also have, for the various other ones, the users union and the civil rights union. We're going to refer back to this slide. We may refer back to the slide a little later, but we do that. The ways in which we kind of like keep our engagement with these communities is through 2 leadership meetings a month and 1 general membership meeting for folks who are just getting engaged in our work to move public policy to address these issues. Queerocracy was originally born out of our HIV/AIDS organizing work, as I organize low-income folks living with HIV who have experienced with homelessness, folks who are already living with the virus. Queerocracy was born out of my desire to wanting to prevent folks from contracting HIV. So Queerocracy is situated as kind of like our HIV prevention model, and it focuses on addressing the social determinants of health, like housing and unemployment and mass incarceration and drug use. We want to address those social barriers to health, or those social conditionings that inform HIV infection, particularly among LGBT young people who are homeless and street involved, right? So we believe that if we can ensure that LGBT young people have access to safe, affordable housing that is their own, it reduces their likelihood of participating in sex trafficking or sex trade, and also being a risk for sexual violence and other forms of violence and assault. So our Queerocracy work is kind of like born out of our HIV prevention model. So our goal for Queerocracy, though, is that Queerocracy will grow and continue to grow and continue to expand beyond our HIV/AIDS portfolio, and could serve as a queering or a queer analysis for our 4 major issues. So what does the drug war look like for queer bodies, or queer, trans, and gender nonconforming bodies? What does mass incarceration look like for those bodies as well? So our desire is to have Queerocracy start to be involved in the decision-making process for these other campaign areas as well. So that's the vocal kind of like model for change.
So we have decision-making process. So what is decision-making? So by definition, engaging emerging communities in the decision-making process extends beyond identifying a problem and or a solution. So it can include it must also include decisions on the process leading toward the situation. So thinking of the journey itself, and not the beginning or the end, but how do you get to that point of the decision?
Yeah, and just to add, we're very aware of how other folks have engaged our communities in the past in decision making. Oftentimes, that decision making process has been like, "Hey, tell us what we need to do," or "Tell us what you need," and that's pretty much it. And it seems more it isn't meaningful about like the process towards that, right? So we believe that meaningful decision making of communities who've been marginalized, right? We reject the language of, hey, how do we reach marginalized communities? Because we're not trying to do that. We're trying to help inspire in emerging communities. In order to have a framework of working with emerging communities rather than marginalized communities, it shifts our focus and makes us be intentional about our process for their meaningful engagement. So that engagement doesn't just begin at identifying what the problem is, nor does it just begin at, hey, tell us what the solution is. For us, that process is, hey, we have to engage you all the way through the process of understanding what you need and understanding what's wrong and understanding what you need, and all the way through the various stages and processes that get there is what we consider to be meaningful engagement to center marginalized communities and transforming them into emerging communities.
All right, so we put together a decision-making structure. So what does this look like? So in the middle, we have decision-making bubble there. And at the bottom of that, it says community involvement. So we have community members, we have young people. What is that? So we have planning, we have identify, we have initiating action and relationships. So for planning, what is the problem? Developing an action plan for that. So thinking of alternative, thinking of clarity, when it comes to young people or just people in general with the decision-making process. The first step is really identifying what is identifying. So identifying those goals, identifying the key strengths, the key challenges, the key concerns, and the key priorities. So what is the needs? Moving to that is initiating that action. So it looks differently depending on which route you want to go down. So at the bottom, we put down some ideas. We have surveys. We have even sitting down with community leaders and having discussions with them, given that community leaders are very much close to the problem as well, and they have a viewpoint of how and how really to navigate the decision-making process. We have interviews, we have focus groups, public meetings, brainstorming, and storytelling. It's very, 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 very important, especially within organizing or just within decision-making in general, because each person's story, it tells something. And when you're in a space where everyone is, can understand their story and understand each other's story, that's also how we move forward. Building relationships. So what is the community needs? Who is at the table? That is a big question that we should always ask when it comes to decision making. If you sit at a table and you see everyone that looks just like you in terms of like having experienced or you don't really have too many emerging communities within that table, is really rethinking of like maybe we should go out into the community, or maybe we should add more people at that table who needs to be at this table. So the way we have different things of breaking it down, so using technology, digital organizing is really, really great to engage people to participate within the advocacy work behind that. So it's collection of stories as well, transforming that data into impactful stories. So the reality, strengthening that policy and that argument around the issue, as well as supporting the mobilization around that. Another one we have is demonstrating the value of mobilizing communities impacted by this inequitable policies and bringing these voices to the discussion, especially when it comes to policy and decision making. And then the last one we have here is emerging communities need to identify their own needs. So that's the great thing about decision making, where you're getting people into a space, we're identifying the needs together as a collective, as Jason was saying, setting their priorities, making that plan, and taking the action for the responsibility of their own future.
And I just want to add another thing about relationships that I think is very critical. So as we think about like who are we inviting to the table, we should also think about ourselves as the person who is making the invitation, right? So oftentimes the relationship we should and we're going to talk about this more in best practices, but power dynamics do exist just inherently in our current construct, in our current society. So recognizing like how you show up in those spaces are really key they're really key, and also can help. They're really key to be mindful of like how you can show up in a space, and understanding what power dynamics may exist in those things and challenge those within yourself. Because we don't want folks that we're inviting to the table to make decisions based upon what they think we may want, right? We want to kind of like make sure that we want to make sure that everyone who we invite to the table, especially if they're marginalized or directly impacted communities, do not look to us as the person who convened the table as the leaders, right? Because oftentimes what will happen is that they will just defer to our decision-making capabilities. But so we have to be very mindful of our power dynamics and how we show up if we really want to transform marginalized communities into emerging communities.
Another one we have here is consensus. So looking at how we come to the decision-making process. So we have two diagrams that's on the side. So as you see the two different diversity within both the tables, it is doing this diagram as I am personally a visual artist. I always try to add that into the component. So at one table, you see the same people that's without community, and having the three, like a pyramid, having the three people at the top who are making those decisions and having those at the bottom who are not making those decisions, compared to those with community at the table. And you see the diversity within that. So looking at the consensus, I'm really exploring, I'm not gonna go over all of these, but really exploring the solutions. So the best one of the group is really emerges from there. Coming to a mutual solution on that and reaching a decision that can accept everyone. So that looks in different ways. A few positives of that. We have some positive and negatives. A positive is bringing conflicts into the open. Another decision or positive is decisions that are thoroughly thought out and encouraging a cooperation within that. And it also promotes solidarity, which is really great because that's how we, I don't want to say create winners, but because everyone is a winner. But it creates a solidarity like, oh, we are a community, and it brings that to space and realize, hey, we have the power to change our future. We have the power to make these decisions. So really bringing that within the person and realizing how that's a community within that. Some negatives that we've noticed are some challenges when it comes to the consistent decision-making structure. Sometimes there are people who will be blocked out of the decision. So I say that in the sense of like, you will not always have a common ground. That happens. But the goal is to get to that common ground. We will also explain how that looks. It also requires really good listening skills because you have so many people at one table that everyone has their own viewpoint of how something should go. So it requires everyone to listen and to really to gravitate that and to really bring that in within themselves. And another one will be promoting commitment to carry out those decisions. So the consensus is really the best for us and how we go through that scale. It looks a little differently from time to time depending on what goal we have going on or what campaign we have going on, but it always goes to like the one at the bottom with community. Everyone is diverse. Everyone brings something to the table to make that overall decision. Do you want to add anything? Alrighty. All right.
So now on to the good stuff, right? Key challenges, because in our work, we've experienced those a lot. First has been like finding a consensus, right? Janae talked a little bit about kind of like what are some ways to get out of that, but finding consensus, especially around visioning, like what we should do and the plan and like how we should do it has been one of the key challenges to centering our community voices in decision making is really getting folks to find a consensus or a common vision and common plan that everyone feels good and believes in. Also, keeping people engaged, right? And most importantly, showing up, right? So like, how do we get folks who are directly impacted as Janae works with LGBT young people who are homeless and very transient, right? It's very difficult to keep folks engaged and to have them show up consistently. So those have been some key challenges with folks who are being involved in decision making and they're not getting paid to, right? And it's kind of like volunteer, right? Also, keeping people updated regularly in your time, right? So like making sure that folks stay regularly updated on what's happening, not only just with the political landscape or the community landscape or the landscapes within your institution, but also about what's happening with the process, right? And then also to add to that is your specific time, right? So one of the key challenges I've had is my ability to actually regularly update folks, right? Because I recognize that like I know that some folks may be showing up to the call where getting folks involved in decision making may not be the primary focus of your job. However, you find it meaningful, right? So like some key challenges is like, how do you manage like actually what you're tasked to do in your work or tasked to do in other areas of life, but wanting to do this in a way that is meaningful, that is impactful, and is not reproducing the harms of like marginalizing or even tokenizing or objectifying communities who are directly impacted, right? So how to do that meaningfully requires time. So sometimes that is a key challenge to do that. And then also another key challenge is trauma, right? The trauma of folks who are directly impacted. And then also self and community stigma often gets in the way from folks' participation. And then also folks' decision making may be informed by their trauma and or self and community stigma. So those are some key challenges. And then also, very, very big on our end is monetary incentive-based culture. And this is particularly found with a lot of LGBT young people. A lot of like Vocal New York, Vocal New York and Craxi, we're not a service provider, right? We are a advocacy direct action organization. So we don't provide services. So we don't have, so a lot of our money that we get in to do this work cannot go to monetary incentives. So it becomes a challenge for us when young people, particularly queer young people and low-income communities of color, the way the service model seems to operate is that they incentivize folks to get involved with their programs. So folks will see our work to getting folks to be engaged in decision-making for advancements of campaign. We'll be asking, well, where's the money? Or how much will this be? Or is there any incentives for them to come? So it's hard. So sometimes, if depending on your organization and depending on your organizational resources, there isn't much funding for the meaningful inclusion of folks in decision-making processes. So monetary incentive-based culture, particularly in like low-income communities, queer communities and community of color, have presented itself to be challenges for the meaningful engagement of folks in decision-making. These slides are slightly out of order, but I will do my best. Wait, I'll go right here. So so some best practices around that is one of the best practices around finding consensus is that one things that we do is we utilize an impact analysis, right? So even if folks cannot all agree on the specific policy or the specific, or if folks do not fully agree with a particular item, right? One of the things that we utilize that has been very well is to do an impact analysis to talk to folks about, hey, so this is what the current political landscape looks like. This is what we're pushing for. It has the likelihood of winning under this particular model, right? So when folks are having a good political education with impact analysis, you can help move them closer to a sense of consensus when everyone is thinking about things systemically and not personally, right? So folks, one of the challenges that we find in folks getting to a consensus is that they have personal ideas, thoughts, and beliefs about things, and those things present challenges on what they may believe to be or think to be most effective. Oftentimes in our work, we'll discuss things systemically using impact analysis, looking at political landscapes and talking about those things. And then we'll discuss those issues in those ways to move folks to a closer place of consensus. And still, we want to make sure that everyone's ideas, thoughts, and critiques are suggested and are a part of our decision making. So we use a prioritizing timelining system. So so one of the ways in which what makes this difficult is this process. So one of the things that makes it easier for us is to prioritize and timeline. I'm going to pause this section because I think this gives a little bit more clarity about our process, right? So our decision-making process is what I should have talked about first before the challenges. So I'm gonna go there. Our decision-making process is that first, before we get folks engaged in decision-making, we first have to educate our community, right? We make sure our folks are educated, right? So that we prepare our community members for meaningful engagement through a process of politicization and political education, right? Folks cannot make informed decisions or good decisions and cannot be seen as or transformed into emerging communities if they do not understand civics 101, if they do not understand like political theory, if they do not understand the politicization of their own struggles. It's going to be very difficult for folks to be engaged meaningfully and to be good critical thinkers if they're not educated and politicized about the world around them and how the issues that impact them are political, right? Oftentimes what we see through trauma is that folks believe that their social oppression is their fault, right? It's because I have HIV, it's because I did this, it's because of who I am, it's because of these things as to reason why my life looks this way. And our work is to reject that notion and politicize that, and to give folks a political education to armor them in not only the world, but then also to prepare them for decision-making of what strategic policies look like and the way to get there. So once we do the political education and politicizing of folks, we then now know that they are prepared to be involved in the decision-making process. So we create a decision-making space where community members can regularly meet, engage with, and inform the vision and or plan, right? We only invite folks to be a part of our decision-making process if they have been adequately educated, because we want to make sure that folks have the right framework and the right perspective to actually engage meaningfully, so it doesn't be a tokenizing experience. We want folks to be enriched by the experiences that they are creating with us. And then after folks are invited to the decision-making space, and they're making decisions, it's our job essentially as the providers or the folks who invited them to perform the agreed upon task and to put the plan in action, right? We have to execute the decisions that were made, and ensure the execution of those. And then we go back to the decision-making table to share updates and give updates and developments from the executed action steps, right? We think this is also very important for the accountability of the folks who are inviting folks to the table, right? So we invite folks to the table so that we can win on our advocacy goals. We want to make sure that they hold us accountable, right? So this is the way that we transform folks from marginalizing to emerging, right, is by giving them a power over like holding us accountable to making sure that we perform the agreed upon tasks and put into action. And then after that, it's repeating the process, right? So after the updates, oftentimes there has to be some more political education. We could talk to folks about introducing a bill, but then when it goes into a particular committee, we have to talk to folks about what that committee means, who's the chair of that committee, and how bills move out of committee, right? It's a great process for political education and politicizing folks who have not been engaged in a political process because of systemic barriers and oppression. So our process is educate, decision make, execute, update, and then re-educate folks based upon the developments, right? Developments could be anything from where the piece of legislation or the advocacy or the proposal went, to educate on like who just got voted out of office and who voted in, and what does that mean for our landscape? What does that mean for our communities? Everything from on electoral level to a social community level, like who's in charge of this nonprofit and what that means for what does that mean for the community or the agency, right? Those things do matter. So making sure that folks are educated about the many areas that may impact and influence their lives. So now we want to like revisit the challenges again, right? It's finding consensus. So through this process, the challenges that we found has been finding consensus, keeping people engaged, keeping people updated regularly, plus your individual time, trauma and self and community stigma, and monetary incentive-based cultures. And the best practices out of those are some ways that we found to work is that we use impact analysis. For finding consensus, we utilize an impact analysis. We discuss things systemically and not personally. And we prioritize and timeline things so that folks' thoughts and ideas are a part of the roadmap. One of the challenges in one of the best practices that we've utilized to keep folks engaged has been really like group chats, right? So utilizing Slack, group messages, and WhatsApp app. Those ways are like we could initiate conversations, but we don't actually have to be engaged fully in all those conversations. It's a great way to kind of like spark debate or spark conversation with folks, but not actually have to be really a part of those things, right? Because you want to kind of like build a team of folks who are working together to help create with you the world that they want to see, right? So oftentimes we use group chat to kind of like keep folks engaged. And one of the ways we find to be the most successful models of keeping folks engaged is by having that body to build community, right? When folks are able to build community with each other, they are able to keep each other engaged and also hold each other accountable. Also, interactive meeting agendas, right? We want to make sure that our meeting agendas, when we call folks to meet, is interactive, engaging, and most importantly, fun, right? We want to have folks that make sure that they're coming here and having a good time and walk away feeling like, hey, I learned something, I contributed, and I also equally enjoyed myself. Then also, another key way of keeping folks engaged is following through on commitments. If we make commitments to our governing bodies, if we make commitments to the decision makers in the communities that we want to center on, that keeps them engaged. It helps to build an element of trust, and that trust is going to be critical for communities who have experienced communities who have experienced trauma and stigma. For you to follow up on your commitments to them helps to increase the trust factor, and that also helps increase their level of engagement. Also, one of the best practices of keeping people regularly updated in your time is keeping fixed meetings and sticking to them, right? Just, hey, saying, hey, every first, third, whichever Monday of the month, we're going to do this from this time to this time. Stick with that. And that also not only keeps folks consistent and engaged, but it keeps folks regularly updated at the same time. And then also using email and group messaging for those quick updates. So letting folks know they're like, hey, this bill just went into, this bill just made it into committee. We're going to talk about it at the next agenda or at the next meeting. So folks can be regularly updated, quickly updated, and receive a lot more of the details when they come to your following meeting. And then also, a key thing, also finding your own investment, right? So you have to be equally invested in not only the work that you are advancing, right, but also equally invested in the people that you are inviting to the table and figuring out finding out what's at stake for you. If when we do this well, and when I say well, I'm talking about like centering community, marginalized communities, and transform it into emerging communities, figuring out what's at stake for you when you do that work well, and what's at stake for your community when you do that work well, and what's at stake when you don't do that well. I want to kind of like pause right here and see if there's any questions before I continue and move on.
Thanks, Jason. No questions yet, but as a reminder to people, if you do think of questions, please write it in the chat so that we can take a look at it and answer it. But something that I was thinking just as you were speaking was around the finding consensus under best practices. If there's no consensus to be found, or if there is consensus, but specific people who are at the table feel very strongly about not moving forward one way or the other, how do you recommend reconciling that?
So oftentimes, what in my experience, one or two things happen. We'll table it, and then we'll revisit it again once we get some more information, because we'll have to figure out what the other people need in order to move to where other folks are, right? So asking folks like, hey, what information do you need, or understanding where folks are hung up at, and then putting it on pause for a minute to get that information that they may need to feel more confident moving to kind of like where the majority of folks are. It's kind of like been one of those processes. So it's just like, hey, sometimes it may be one person who's strongly against it, and just talking to them and figuring out what that individual may need in order to move forward in that way. And oftentimes, in my experience, folks who felt strongly about something and they been in the minority oftentimes had to deal with their own personal stuff, right? It never really had to do with kind of like the external, like, political situation, and mostly probably had to do with like something that they had a previous bad experience being with another organization who didn't work with this politician, or like, so it's really some type of personal hung up that they were on. And then oftentimes, like, so what will happen then, if I recognize that as the case, is that I will have a one-to-one with that person to talk to them a little bit, and then I will talk to them outside the group setting, to just figure out, like, to talk them more through that.
Yeah. Thanks. No other questions as yet.
Okay, cool. So some other best practices around, so two remaining best practices around working with folks who have experienced trauma and self and community stigma. One, just meeting folks where they are and just always being compassionate. You know, compassion is the key. Also, two, politicizing folks' oppression has been very helpful to getting folks out of their trauma and out of self and community stigma. For me, it took me a long time. As a person living with HIV for like 10 years, it took me quite a long time to be okay with my status and not allow it to block me from my work. Once I was able to politicize it and recognize that that my community having HIV epidemic proportion had more to do with government inaction and issues of poverty than it had to do with my behavior, right? So, you know, politicizing folks' oppression from what I've seen in this work that I've done, both internally, externally, has been a very useful tool in getting folks to engage in deep and meaningful ways. And then also, most importantly, is just supporting folks' mental health, right? Connecting them to resources and tools is very key as well, right? Because we all don't have that experience or are able to talk folks through their traumas and their oppressions. So oftentimes it's just knowing where folks can go and pointing them in that direction, so that they can get the support and assistance that they need, so that they can engage meaningfully. And then also, our way to counteracting a monetary incentive-based culture is that we try to do a media-based incentives, right? We want to get folks out there to be in front of the cameras, to write op-eds, to share their stories, to do the things that gets them the things that they would like to see, right? So even though we say like, hey, we can't give you $15 to come to this meeting, and we can't do that, that's not what our organizational capacity is. We can emphatically say and very boldly say that, like, hey, you working with us, we'll, we can help you become a leader in your community, if that's what you want, right? So we try to identify folks. Also, this is also a key point. We try to identify folks who also who also have a desire to be a leader in their community, right? And so we do kind of like media-based incentives, and that incentives are like, hey, well, we're going to train you into like, doing media work, speaking in front of cameras, all that stuff like that. And so that's how the way we counteract that monitoring.
All right, and I want to briefly add to Jason's point of meeting folks where they are, and compassion is key. It's so simple. It's really listening. To add to that, to listen to what people are saying, what communities are saying, and also removing yourself out of the equation for a moment, and to listen to like Jason was saying, the stories. Like all these different things are part of meeting people where they are, as we think of oppression, as we think of the general external version of what that is and how that trickles to who we are on an interpersonal and internal level, is really just listening to folks. So yes.
Okay, cool. So perfect example. So like some of these successes, like we've through our work, many of the folks in these images right now are young people who are part of our decision-making process. They were politicized on a bad deal, a deal that we saw bad coming from New York City's budget process. We quickly organized folks around this budget process, talked to folks about kind of like what they actually wanted. And out of the budget, when it comes to LGBT youth beds and beds for young people in New York City, and came up with, and they actually came up with some decisions on like how aggressive the work should look like and all those things like that. And we supported that. And that work granted them on the cover of Gay City News for their Pride edition earlier this year. Oh, and not only did they get the additional press, but they also secured an additional $2 million to support homeless youth in New York City. So their work to secure $2 million in New York City's budget for young people granted them the cover of Gay City News in New York City. So it was so our craxi members not only were engaged in the decision-making process around kind of like what their advocacy acts was and the roadmap on how to get there. That also their reward for that, I guess, was to be on the cover of Gay City News and have that story profiled. It was a very proud moment for many of our members, and those are kind of like now through that process they become more deeply committed to craxi and the work that they do, and then most importantly their own leadership. Questions and answers.
That's great. We did have another question that came in, just talking about how political bureaucracy prevents meaningful engagement. So in those situations where trying to meaningfully connect with the community to get input and to get diverse perspectives, how do you do that without tokenizing people while also acknowledging that it might prevent meaningful engagement?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
So Sometimes political bureaucracy prevents meaningful engagement, but it still requires community input and voice. How do you elicit this without tokenizing people while acknowledging that this isn't meaningful engagement?
Good question.
So the ways in which we engage community in that process is the question?
Without tokenizing.
Without
correct?
tokenizing.
Yes, especially under sort of like bureaucratic systems. And
Yeah, okay, I get you. So there's two approaches, right? The first approach is that one, folks should challenge that bureaucracy, right? Definitely challenge that system and challenge that bureaucracy, right? We you know, as activists in the group, like we need to challenge those systems internally, and I understand not everyone's able to do that in their spaces, but I want to like encourage folks to figure out ways to challenge and interrupt those bureaucracies that attempt to like tokenize marginalized communities. So there's that. But I think also the way to kind of like circumvent that would be to build slowly, right? I believe that if you can build something that is slow and not so interrupted, or build something kind of like slow and small and grow it, I think that could, what's the way I can say that? That could be your cover in a sense. So I would love to hear more specifics about this to give a more clearer answer. But I want folks to know that they can reach out to us directly. We'll give folks our contact information if folks want to talk about this a little bit more directly. But I would say that engage folks, create the structure first, and then strengthen it. Right. I think these structures are very important to make sure that we engage these communities, and those structures need to exist. And I believe that through the sheer existence of those, we can can grow and advance those to being more meaningful in those ways. And there's ways to also, so there's been situations where I created kind of like these systems or these like decision-making tables, and I kind of like buffered the tokenizing stuff that a bureaucratic system was implementing, right? So there's some ways that you can like buffer that to ensure that experience isn't tokenizing for folks, even though like those kind of like institutional bureaucracies and institutional structures may operate oppressively. As a person who is in the middle, can help buffer that so that the impacts of those are not re-traumatizing to the people that you're inviting to that space. So there's multiple strategies and solutions around this. But I think like one of the most meaningful things, one of the most critical is like, how can you like buffer the impacts of tokenization, right? Because tokenization happens, and tokenization does happen, but there's ways to buffer that so that experience doesn't actually lead to trauma or leads to folks not wanting to be engaged and further marginalizing them. There's ways to do that. And if someone wants to talk more offline about that, I can talk about those strategies.
Sure. No other questions.
Let me thank you all. If folks have any questions, I think we have a few more minutes. But here is our social media. If folks want to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And then also I'm going to go back to the top where you can find our contact information if you have any questions, additional questions or things you want to talk about offline.
Sure. So I want to thank you all again for just taking the time to join today's webinar and all of your questions. And thank you, Jason and Janae, for your insightful overview. I'll be following up with everyone who joined today's webinar and others who expressed interest in receiving like a recording of the presentation, other information, just so that folks have more time to unpack it. I know that it was very robust and very helpful. So that will be made available as well. But as Jason said, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out directly to him and Janae or me, and we can help connect you with who best can answer it.
Thank you.
All right. Any other closing thoughts or closing remarks? No. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. That's so